All right. Let's see. This is past Blake and Jason. Going to be talking to future Mosaic. So
Yeah, it's good.
we'll be on the big screen on Sunday morning. So
Hey, Mosaic.
hello, everybody. This is what we look like from the past. Um, yeah. Seriously, thanks for taking space to do this. So
Yeah, my privilege, man.
you're in the middle of a book tour. Where are you at right now?
I'm actually in South Bend for about 72 hours. So
Okay.
I'm at home for a minute before we head to Denver and then Ireland.
Nice, Ireland, man. That's cool.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I've messaged you before, but what we're going to be doing is taking the next couple weeks and talking through the Beatitudes.
Yeah.
And original intention was just to jump into the Sermon on the Mount,
Yeah.
but just keeping up with you and the book and hearing other interviews you've done, I was just like, it'd be really cool to stop for a season and just do one Beatitude a week.
Yeah.
And
Nice.
because the large part for what we've done, the last 2 years is we've taught through parts of the scriptures, but we've done so more topically,
Yeah.
and like we did some like Bible stories for grown-ups kind of season of like we're gonna try to talk about the Bible, go these old stories that we kind of were raised with and revisit them. We did that for a season. We did some kind of similar stuff with the Gospels and stuff like that. But this is really the first time we're gonna just slowly work through a text, which is gonna
Yeah.
be cool.
Nice.
And
Nice.
I'm really excited about just doing one beatitude at a time. So we'll talk about that in a second. But most of our people have heard me reference you or South Bend a hundred times. But if you want to tell everybody a little bit about yourself, and then we can jump in.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Jason Miller. I live in South Bend, Indiana. I'm kind of a Midwest mutt, born in Ohio and landed here when I was 10 years old. And I've been a pastor my whole adult life. And in 2015, 2016, we set out to launch South Bend City Church, which is my primary work. So we're here in South Bend. The context here really matters. South Bend is a small Midwestern city with a lot of complicated dynamics. On the one hand, Notre Dame is here, the university, and so that drives some of the income and culture. But on the other hand, it's more like a kind of Midwestern Rust Belt city that lost a ton of employment and prosperity in the 1960s when the Studebaker car factory went out of business. Studebaker cars used to be one of the big four before there was just three. And in one day, something like 30,000 people lost their jobs in a city of 130,000. And so in some ways, the city feels like it's never really come all the way back from that. There's a ton of beauty and a ton of creativity in the city, and there's also a ton of poverty and hardship, and we get to be a community in the middle of all that. So our church, we have lots of ways of describing ourselves. We're interested in following Jesus, and we're interested in sort of embracing some of the mystery and complexity of that. A lot of our people have come out of evangelical worlds theologically or church-wise. Evangelical is a word that probably wouldn't describe us today, not as a matter of scorning that as much as just a matter of clarity. We call ourselves a community for believers and doubters, and everybody's a little bit of both. We call ourselves liturgically promiscuous because we like to borrow from these different streams of Christian worship rather than kind of just getting locked into one. And I could go on and on. But yes, we have a church here in South Bend, and that's my main work. And then we got a book out there now too.
Yeah. And this is book number 1, right?
Yeah, book number 1.
Yeah, ready for book number 2 already, probably.
Working on it. Yeah.
Well, cool. So I got the book, and I'm on chapter. I don't remember now. I just started. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness.
Yeah.
And I'd probably be farther, but I got stuck on the first 2, and I just read it and then reread it, and then read the second chapter, and then reread it. And I told our people this last week whenever I was telling them I was interviewing you, was for the last season of my life, I've kind of shelved a lot of spiritual books or just Christian books. And
I see animals over your left shoulder there.
Yeah. Lots of books over here. Now, this is my latest one. It's about dinosaurs. So
Nice.
it's the rise and fall of dinosaurs. So I've been reading stuff like that. And so I've just kind of shelved a bunch. And but you came out with this one, and so it was one that I wanted to pick up again. and that's just doing something to me. And you told a story in forgot exactly what it was, but you talked about you stepping into the Beatitudes in your Bible, and it was
Yeah.
some of the pages that were less used.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, they weren't less used. They were virgin, untouched pages.
Yeah. Yeah, and it seems to be a lot of our story, at least some of my story with Beatitudes. You know, there's 1,000 ways to work through them and understand them. But before we talk more about the Beatitudes and the book, could you just give us like the origin of you writing the book and where it all started for you there?
Yeah. 2010, I got invited over to Israel Palestine to um, do this little learning experience where a cohort of 5 of us pastors were sort of taken around to meet with both Israelis and Palestinians and to understand just all the different narratives of experience that are part of the conflict there. And I went into it wholly unprepared for the amount of pain and difficulty that I was going to encounter there. And man, after it, for the record, it's just worse than anybody hears about in the U.S. And the stories of suffering and terror and violence, kind of on both sides of it. It's really bad. And a few days into the trip, I just reached kind of a breaking point where I started to feel pretty nihilistic, pretty despairing. And in particular, that I'd kind of been ruminating on this dark mantra that I didn't like choose this. I just found myself thinking over and over again, like, there's no way this gets better, man. It's just too deeply entrenched. And I think probably coming from a fairly privileged place, life in the States, having not been confronted with a lot of situations like that, I'm pretty rattled by it. And then in the middle of all that, I encountered the Beatitudes at this little Melkite Christian church. Melkite's this ancient tradition of the church that still exists over in that part of the world. And we walked into one of these churches where the Beatitudes were engraved on the steps. And that combined with a dark-skinned Jesus in an icon in the church holding up an Arabic text that read, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." It just sort of shook me up just enough to have me go back to my hotel room that night and read the Beatitudes with kind of a fresh hunger and curiosity. And what I quickly began to feel was just how well Jesus was describing like my own experience. Like I felt like my soul had been vacated, like my soul had been robbed, and the first blessing he gives is for those who have a poverty within them. I mean, there were moments in the trip where all of us were like sobbing, weeping, not just like teary, but I mean like weeping in solidarity to some of the stories that we were hearing. And then Jesus has a blessing for those who mourn. I could go on, but that it was just kind of the right moment, the right time for me to hear those words differently. And then for like 13 years now, I keep bumping into ways that he's just describing like really accurately the kind of spiritual and emotional terrain that we face when we suffer.
Yeah. Could you work us through some of those like traditional interpretations of the Beatitudes, and then what do you think they actually hold out for us?
Yeah. So the Beatitudes. It's important to note, they come at the beginning of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew, the way that Matthew tells Matthew's story in the Gospels, Matthew's kind of trying to position Jesus as the new Moses for his Jewish audience. So when you get to Matthew 5, after Jesus has come up out of Egypt, which happens earlier in the book of Matthew, and some other things happen there to really position him as the new Moses, and then he goes up on the mountainside. Well, Jewish hearers who are seeing Jesus as the new Moses, the mountain is Sinai, right? I mean, he sort of gives the new law. And by law, I don't mean bad news before the good news. I mean the way that God said to the Israelites, "I've liberated you. Now I want to lead you in freedom." And so there's a lot that kind of goes into that text being really important. And then for 2,000 years, if people want to read further, there's a scholar named Rebecca Eklund who's written a book called The Beatitudes Through the Ages, and it's she does a really nice job of serving different interpretations over the 2,000 years. You can find people who, in the early ages, they kind of wanted to make these kind of virtuous things, like poor in spirit became a virtuous posture. It's the person who empties of themselves of everything but God, so that God will then fill them. So it becomes sort of a, well, here's how, what you do to get blessed. So then, it's kind of like, here's the carrot, and so do what it takes to receive the carrot. And same goes with other blessings. Then you see a movement at some point where people start to notice that the first four blessings of the Beatitudes sound different than the second four blessings of the Beatitudes. And there's different ways people carve out that difference. But to me, the first four describe pretty radical experiences of disempowerment, um, poor in spirit, mourning, meekness, and hungering and thirsting for righteousness or justice. And then the second four describe certain postures in the world. Numbers 5, 6, and 7 do. Merciful, pure in heart, and peacemakers. And then he gives a blessing for the persecuted, which we can go further into. But that seems to kind of stand on its own as a way of kind of wrapping everything up. Sadly, there's been kind of a whole movement in the last kind of post-Reformation where the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, all of that gets kind of turned into like, well, that's all still part of the law, and we're here for the gospel of grace, and so that's not really for us.
Yeah.
Which I couldn't more strongly disagree with. But yeah, I think they're stranger than people think they are, and I think the strangeness of the Beatitudes is kind of the key to what they're trying to do for us.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a good example is, well, at least how you talk about it in the book. In chapter 1, or with the poor in spirit, you use the analogy of a container versus a conduit.
Yeah.
Could you work through that for us?
Yeah. So let me start by saying, I don't think Jesus wants you to kind of summon some poverty within you. I don't read it that way. But what's he doing then? One way of working this out is that the language of the soul is really helpful for me. I know some people have a hard time with it, but I think the language of the soul describes that part of you that holds all the parts of you together. The language of the soul describes something that includes and holds together physiology and psychology and neurology and all that stuff, but also somehow it sort of expands beyond that. And I think a lot of us who would use the language of the soul would say that it's from the soul that we live, right? It's kind of the wellspring. It's where things like love and joy and power and peace and hope are all kind of springing from. So it's really important. It's kind of the engine that drives our humanity. And yet all of us, I think, pretty early on discover the soul's kind of permeable, right? If I love you and you go through something hard, I can find my own inner world racked by it, and that's not a good feeling, when I get wounded by the world, you discover that this thing within can be kind of tender, kind of vulnerable. And I think a lot of us, well, not all of us, I think all of us end up basically building these defensive strategies around the soul. And it's like we don't realize it, but what we're doing is pretending as if that soul is like a container, and you can kind of contain within it everything you need. And a good container is one that doesn't have any leaks, right? So we build all these defenses around the soul. For people who like to follow the ideas of the Enneagram, one way of understanding the Enneagram is that it names 9 different ways that we build these defenses around the soul. But of course, the problem with all that is if the soul is actually a conduit, not a container, well, then everything that we do to block it up, to kind of lock it up, actually prevents it from being a conduit of the life of God that wants to come through us. And so while I don't think Jesus is happy that you've been robbed in spirit, I think he knows that you have to kind of trust that vulnerability within you. Because the minute that you try to basically eliminate that vulnerability of the soul, you're also simultaneously cutting yourself off from that love and life that want to flow through you. And so it's big, brave stuff to learn how to trust those moments where you feel poured out and emptied. But I think he's trying to help us understand that it's by not running from that or defending it that you're going to go deeper into your capacity as a conduit for all that love and goodness that wants to come through you.
Yeah, that's good. I highlighted on page 37, I think it was.
Oh yeah, page 37.
You know page 37? Start quoting it to me. Yeah, you say if we're going to allow, so the soul is not a closed system. if we're going to allow the life of God to flow through us, we may have to unlearn some of the ways that we've come to defend our souls.
Yes.
I don't know. That was really powerful, because even in the sense of like defending ourselves to the things, like feels at least originally for me, it's like, okay, this is like a holy endeavor in the sense of like I'm going to like learn to persevere and not just take this like just let the stuff roll over me, but take it well, and and even with some of my own hurt and pain, it's like whenever you wrote that, I felt like there was lists in my head of, okay, these are ways that I'm defending myself or defending my soul, and at the bottom you say for some it looks different. The case looks different for some people. For some, it's an ability we develop, and we sense the preferences of others in the room and conform ourselves to those preferences. We figure out whatever is esteemed in the particular environment. We fashion ourselves in that image. Some of us build out a case for our capacity for dominance. You basically walk through some of that Enneagram stuff too. You're talking about. Yeah. Anyways, we build something around the soul to protect it. I thought that was brilliant. Sorry, I'm going to read you one more part of your book. I don't know if you like this or if it's annoying, but
well, it's helpful to remember what's in the book sometimes.
That was good. I'm trying to find where. Oh yeah, right here. The idea that God may be able to work with the experience of our suffering, that God may have found a way to use the poverty in our souls as an opportunity to give us God's own life, isn't an attempt to explain suffering. It's just an observation that Jesus seems to be making about the surprising possibilities of what can happen when things break. I thought it was really good.
Yeah, one thing I'm trying to be really careful about is that there's so many toxic theologies that like baptize suffering.
Yeah.
And what's even worse is they baptize the circumstances that cause the suffering.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm really not. That's really not where I'm going with this. So I'm trying to be careful that I don't sort of misspeak. I don't think that because suffering can produce good fruit in us that we should then be passive in the face of what's broken in the world. Right? It's like if you're suffering in your home or in a broken marriage, this is not a call to just suck it up and bear it.
Sure.
If you're suffering in a world that has some systems built that are opposed to who you are or that are unjust toward you, this is not a call to simply like be consoled by this faith and then do nothing about those things. It's just that maybe part of the mystery and the grace of God is that even while we try to build better homes and better worlds, in the meantime, suffering can be a pathway toward growth and healing. Yeah, that's what we're saying here.
Yeah. The whole a lot of the stuff around suffering or the causes of our pain and our trauma, it's all like trying to be super analytical. Really, for some of it, for me, it's like trying to analyze it, and that's never been helpful, for people. It's like trying to get to some of those nuts and bolts. Yeah. I think even your explanation of the word "blessed" is really helpful in that regard. Like, could you walk through that?
Yeah. This is one of the reasons I say that the blessings are really strange. Like they don't add up, So like in our English Bibles, each beatitude begins with the word "blessed are," or some translations say "happy are." I know blessing is kind of a complicated word religiously for people, maybe #blessed,
Yeah.
But I try to work this out because, like I said, it underscores the fact that these are not very straightforward. So when the English translation says "blessed are," Jesus is speaking in Aramaic. He would have harkened back to the Hebrew word "ashrei," which, if you read the Hebrew scriptures and you look for that word "ashrei" or like "blessed" in the Hebrew scriptures, over and over and over again, there's basically one big idea behind that word, which is the blessed person is someone who enjoys a divine insurance policy against suffering. And usually the reason they enjoy an insurance policy against suffering from God is that they're righteous or virtuous. So Psalm 1's a good example. Blessed is the man who doesn't walk in the counsel of sinners or the wicked or whatever. And it's basically you're blessed because you resist evil and sin. And through that, then God promises like prosperity for you. So that's one layer. But then the next layer is the gospel is actually written in Greek. And so while Jesus would have actually spoken Aramaic, by the time it made it into Matthew's writing, the first word there for blessed is makarios in the Greek. And Dallas Willard is a philosopher who's really helpful here, and he says that that word in the Greek describes the blissful existence of the gods. I think of like if anybody ever like flies on big airplanes, I think of like global first class with the lay flat beds. Like life is just good up there on the other side of that curtain, while the rest of us plebeians are back here in economy basic, like fighting for the knee room. And the Greeks really did kind of conceive of the deities living sort of removed from all of our trouble and suffering, and they even have whole stories that they tell about the ways that the deities insulated themselves from human suffering. So then Jesus, in the seat of Moses, in Matthew's gospel, gets up there on the mountaintop to give the new word from God. And he says, "Blessed are," and you can kind of imagine the anticipation from these people. Like, oh man, let's get some health and wealth going, bro. Like, let's get the formula that we need. Just tell us how to secure for ourselves a divine insurance policy against suffering. Tell us how to secure for ourselves the blissful existence of the gods. And then he describes those first four in particular: poverty within you, mourning, like loss, meekness, which I kind of take to mean that circumstances or systems around you have bridled you so that your power can do you no good. And then those who are aching, hungry, and thirsting for righteousness or justice. And it's so absurd that like it's almost like this is an indicator that the genre of this expression is not like straightforward instructions. It's not formulaic. I think paradox is the only meaningful category for this, which is paradox is when you set two things side by side that seem so contradictory that either it's absurd or setting them side by side is a way of pointing at a mystery that it's not that it's unknowable, but it's a mystery that lives kind of at a higher level of consciousness or a deeper level of life than the one that we live at every day. And that's the only way I can make sense of him saying, "Blessed are," and then dropping in these strange categories of suffering.
Yeah. It's like dualism is easier. So
that's right. That's exactly right, man.
Yeah, either or is. Yeah, the strict levels and rigid system is a whole lot easier than how Jesus is seemingly laying these things out there.
Yeah, and I can even tell, like, I've been doing some conversations around the book, and sometimes, it's like, sometimes people push me really hard. They're like, but like, what's the practical application of these? And I'm like, that's the thing, man. Like, a lot of us have been raised in churches our whole life where a good sermon is one where you walk out with three very clear things to do. And then if you do those things, then the promise made by the preacher was, then you're going to get this from God, and here's how it's going to go. And I don't think that's, I see no evidence for that there. I think something a little more mysterious is going on. But even the to-do list kind of keeps you in power, doesn't it? The to-do list says, cool, if I do X, Y, and Z, I can secure for myself the things that I want from God. And I think Jesus is like right out of the gate, which is kind of baller, man. Like the first word of his big sermon, he refuses to play those games and instead sort of scatters these blessings out on the world that you can't control them, you can't manipulate them, you can't leverage them, but you can carry them with you. And then on the days when your heart breaks, they can work with you,
Yeah, I think as a Rohr, or he probably took it from someone. He talks about mystery is something that's not. It's not unknowable. It's something that's endlessly knowable.
Yeah,
or something like that.
He's who I've heard that from. Yeah,
something like that. And same word with paradox.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's easy to read these teachings from Jesus, or the whole larger Sermon on the Mount, or just Jesus in general, or Christianity in large part, and see it as the strict, rigid, dualistic system. Know. And whenever we've been kind of, go ahead.
I was going to say there's a theologian named Matthew Fox who actually says paradox is precisely the genre of speech that we invented as human beings to speak of mystery.
Wow.
Yeah, so I think you're right on. Yeah. There's kind of an alignment there between if the thing we're pointing at is a mystery, the language we're going to use might be a paradox.
Yeah. That's good. I got more. And I told you I wasn't going to read anymore. But I'm not
anything you want to do, man.
So, let's see here. All right, so blessed are those who mourn, after they should be comforted. Where am I at? 62.
Oh, yeah, 62. That's a good
62.
one.
Yeah, okay. This one was hard for me to work through, again, because the whole mourning and lament is, it's just so foreign to a lot of our experience with Christianity. Like a lot of our church services largely ignore mourning or lamenting, or if we do highlight it, there's always, I think you even talked about it with the Psalms, like reading the Psalms in a sense, like there's a lot of lamenting and mourning, but there's always a praise at the end.
Yeah.
And that feels like a lot of our Christianity in general is like we can mourn something, but we're always going to tagline it, to catch it, and
that's
lead
right.
people. We can't
that's
just like actually go through the stuff. But on 62, 63, you say this capacity is what gives grief its strange power, like never-ending, like a nerve ending that's exposed. Our ability to sense the glory in things is what makes such profound pain possible, and the loss of those things. It's why we're so tempted to turn away from our grief. If you've suffered, you've probably lost something, and that loss is more than a psychological inconvenience, more than the unfortunate consequence of our attachments. It's the loss of the glory that radiated in that life, that hope, that dream, that faith. And the deep within us cries out when some of that glory is taken away. Could you work through that? And we quoted before Psalm 42, the deep calls to deep. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. Let's see. Where to start? So the Psalms of Lament are like a genre in the Old Testament, and they almost always do the same thing. You mentioned it. They name a lament, usually pretty aggressively. I mean, they say pretty crazy stuff like, God, you have made us a haunt for jackals.
Yeah.
Or, Lord, you have torn the world open. So they come out pretty emo, but then they usually, almost always, then they end in praise. And on the page, that can look pretty cheap, I think. Like, oh man, verse 1, you're weeping, you're bleeding, but by verse 8, you're praising. And I think that, like you mentioned, that can kind of mirror some of the sometimes pretty unhealthy spirituality that shows up in our churches, where it's almost like we use that turn toward praise to bypass the reality of our suffering, which ends up being a real act of unhealth and a lack of integrity, because pretty soon you're not really living in the truth of what's going on. But an important thing to remember about spiritual texts is they often express in microcosm something that takes much longer. Just because it only takes you like 5 minutes to read on the page from lament to praise doesn't mean that you or I are meant to move from one to the other that quickly. So if you leave behind that kind of like takeaway, if you kind of set that down for a minute, you could just ask, is there something about lament that intrinsically leads us into an expanded capacity for wonder or praise? And that's what I'm kind of wrestling with in that chapter there. And through a long story I tell in the book, it's probably better read than told. I've really come to believe that, so there's another feature in the Psalms, which is, it's really clear that these writers, these ancient writers in the Bible, that they had a kind of imagination for the world around us that we largely don't have anymore. We kind of lost it in the last few hundred years. Richard Beck is a thinker who calls it enchantment.
Mm-hmm.
And he's kind of borrowing from Charles Taylor, who's an important philosopher who speaks of disenchantment. And basically the idea is that, like in the modern world, we've sort of lost the idea that there's a kind of divine mystery in the world around us. And the psalmists speak of it. They say things like, God, the heavens declare your glory, as if like it's more than, clouds and sunlight up there. There's something of like divine glory radiating in the material world up there. And the same goes for human beings. God, you've crowned humanity and made us a little lower than the angels, and you've crowned us with glory and honor. Like something, I'm not trying to go on like some hardcore pantheist thing or whatever. I think God is God's own thing. Not that God's a thing. That's a whole other conversation. But there is some strange kind of way that God seems to put some of God's self in everything, And then when the psalmist says deep calls to deep, it's almost as if not only like Blake, you have some mystery of God is in you and in me and in the world around us, but also there's a deep within you that's capable of knowing the depth around you. Almost like there's a radar within you that kind of senses not just the material beauty, not just the aesthetic sense of things, but the glory in things. And I think when we lose like someone we love, or even like a relationship, or something else that really matters. I think there's kind of this God-shaped thing inside you that mourns the loss of the God-shaped thing in them. And so then back to those Psalms of Lament and Praise. If when we lose someone or something that matters, maybe part of the temptation to ignore that grief or to medicate that grief or to numb that grief or to drink away that grief or to entertain away that grief or work away that grief or whatever, is that when we turn toward the grief, the pain's pretty deep. But when you turn toward the grief, it's like you're reinforcing your own conscious connection to that capacity with him. And so maybe, just maybe, acts of lament and rituals of loss make it more likely that we'll discover in a really deep way that even while we might have lost the person or the thing, we haven't lost that glory. And that's kind of mystical, honestly. Like everyday mystical. I don't mean like became a monk mystical, although you're welcome to do that. That's great too. But I mean just everyday mystical that somehow I think there's kind of an unfractured wholeness in God that's being expressed in all the individual pieces around here. And I think that unfractured wholeness, we kind of meet it again when we mourn sometimes. And there's a huge healing moment in that for us, where we discover that maybe if it was good, if it was of God, maybe it isn't really lost, maybe it's just transformed. And I've come to think that's the kind of comfort that Jesus is talking about. And that's why these psalmists perhaps turn to praise at the end of these really gnarly kind of laments that they write out.
Yeah, I have 1,000 more questions, but we don't have time to work them all. I haven't read it yet. I haven't got there yet, but I think it's the persecuted one that you talked about with evil being a limited resource.
Yeah.
I've heard you teach on it before in other interviews you've done. Could you just quickly work through that for us? I thought that was really helpful.
Yeah, I'd love to. I know that in the world it can feel like evil or entropy or things falling apart. It can feel like that's kind of the primary force or engine in the world at work right now. And it seems kind of inexhaustible and unlimited. And I get it. I think it feels that way when you watch a lot of the headlines right now. I think it feels that way in a lot of our personal lives too. It can feel like love and goodness and healing and wholeness are the exceptions to the rule, and then the rule is everything falling apart. But I really believe that evil is a limited resource, and the center of that conviction for me comes from the death and resurrection of Jesus. In the death of Jesus, I see evil really like unloading everything it had. I mean, at every level, from the personal to the systemic, I see, the power of the empire and the power of religion conspiring to kill him. I see the betrayal of his best friends playing a part in his death, which is kind of like the whole gamut, So it's like evil unloads everything it has. I mean, they brutalize him, they mock him, they abuse him, and then they kill him. And so in that moment, evil having like exhausted its arsenal, you're kind of waiting there for a couple of days, wondering what will happen, and then in that resurrection moment, to me, like one of the revelations of that moment is that after evil has unloaded all of its resources, love still has more to say. God still has more to give. The forces, the powers, the spirit that heals has not been defeated or exhausted, even though evil has been in that moment. And so that's where that comes from for me, that evil is a limited resource. And then the reason that shows up in that chapter is because the last blessing that Jesus gives is for the persecuted. And for persecution, I don't think he's talking about American Christians who are offended because somebody said Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas, right? I think he's talking about when evil has targeted you, when evil is actively pursuing you. And if evil is an unlimited resource, well then whatever, man. Persecution could be everywhere for everyone. But if evil is a limited resource and evil has chosen to direct some of its resources against you, the only logical takeaway from that is that you have become the kind of person whose own life is sort of so rooted in, so invested in the kind of the healing work of God, the healing work of love. You've kind of been transformed. You've been converted. Your own life, the energy of your life is pushing things in the direction of healing. And so evil decides that with its limited arsenal, it's got to direct some of that arsenal against you. And I take that to be even more hopeful because it's just like 7 verses earlier that he was speaking to people who are disempowered and suffering really badly, and there's no indication that like after he blesses the poor in spirit and those who mourn and those aching for righteousness, it's not like he swaps out audiences and then gathers up like some other group of well-to-do up-and-comers who seem really powerful and potent in the world. No, it's like he's assuming that the same people who are suffering, if they simply consent to the inner experience of their suffering and therefore allow it to be healed, at some point that's going to lead them in a direction where their lives become so powerful and potent that evil's going to have to come after them. And that's, to me, like the hopeful arc in the Beatitudes, is that you're not going to get there by denying your suffering. You're going to get there by owning it. And somewhere in that kind of, somewhere in those dark shadows of loss and loneliness, something's going to get forged in you, unleashed in you, put back together in you, that's going to make you a high-value target.
Yeah, it's really good. Quick, which Beatitude was the hardest for you to work through?
Blessed are those who mourn was the most emotionally challenging. I had to kind of write my way through a really hard loss in that chapter. Yeah. And then I think the chapter that might have been the most, more like kind of like less emotionally challenging, more challenging in the writing work, was chapter 1, or chapter 2, sorry, the Blessed are the Poor in Spirit. Because, I mean, you're through it now. I think I knew what that blessing is doing in me, but the more I tried to put words on it, the more I was like, man, I hope I could feel myself kind of reaching for some things that kind of live at the edge of language. So, yeah, I kind of came out of the gate with a challenging chapter there.
Yeah, starting out. That's good. Yeah, the Blessed Are Those Who Mourn, your story in it, incredible. And we have your book, and a lot of people are going to get the book, or if they haven't already, so they'll work through that. But all that, I love the book, and it's been incredible for me so far. So much love on that regard.
Oh, man. That means the world to me, man. I think really high for you, so to hear that coming from you means a lot.
Well, thanks. If you got a second, could you set up the Sermon on the Mount for us real quick?
Yeah, well, give me a little more on that.
We're about to take some foreseeable future and just take some time in these teachings of Jesus. So we'll start with the first Beatitudes, and we'll work through those. Yeah. And then we'll take some time to work through the teachings. But why should we? Should we? Is it a good thing to do this? And then with all the stuff around it, like I studied all the debates with we write off Jesus really easily. And
sure.
Should we follow these things? Are they meant for us to be followed? Is this all that stuff?
I love it.
So just tease us enough to where we get in it.
Yeah, I'll start here. I had dinner a couple years ago with a couple of people who were concerned about me and my church, and I kind of thought that we might be kind of have the wrong idea. We have this long dinner, and they were trying hard to understand, and they really were hammering me like, what is the God? And they were coming from a theological framework that, by the way, has only existed for about 500 years. But they had a really particular view of what they think the gospel is and how the Bible describes it. And I was trying to tell them, I just said, like, well, the full title of the book of Matthew is The Gospel According to Matthew, and the Gospel According to Mark, and the Gospel According to Luke, and the Gospel According to John. Those aren't called Gospels just for the heck of it. They're called Gospels because from the beginning of the church, it was believed that they were telling the gospel, giving the good news, Yeah. And then Matthew 4, Matthew writes that Jesus was going around proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom of heaven. So if you're looking for like what's the center of the meaning of Jesus and why we would even care about him and what he has to say to us, and if there's any hope in what he's offering us, I think there's a really good case to be made that it's in everything that was being sort of infleshed and demonstrated in his own life, and that includes his death and his resurrection for sure. And there's important stuff to work out there theologically. But if in Matthew 4, Jesus is going around and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of heaven, Matthew 5, 6, and 7 seem to be him saying, it's yours right now if you want it. Not just a transactional sort of reckoning with your sin problem, but I mean the life of God is yours right now. And I'm here to tell you, like, is it given to you if you want it? Not just forgiveness, it includes forgiveness for sure, but it's more than that. The life of God is yours right now if you want it. And then it's like, he's like, so let me tell you what it looks like. And then he describes a way of being in the world through Matthew 5, 6, and 7 that I'm like, if every one of us found our way toward living that kind of life, we wouldn't have to wonder if it was good news. We'd be confronted with the fact that it's good news every day, you know. To read Matthew 5, 6, and 7 and just ask, like, what if what he's saying is that with God, we could incrementally become the people who live this way? And then tell me, how would that not be good news, you know? But I do think he starts with these strange blessings because it is gift. You know, I don't think it's just a new ethic. I think it's more mysterious than a new ethic. It's a way of life that God lives in and through you. And I think it somehow strangely begins with the Beatitude blessings, but don't stop there, because most of the picture of that life is made plain in the next few chapters.
Yeah, that's really good. Hey, to end, could you read that final? I don't remember where it's at. It's at the end of your book, the blessing that you wrote.
I'd love to. Yeah, let me grab a copy of my book real quick.
All right.
Yeah. This is kind of my attempt to stretch out these blessings in a way that I know I've been carrying with me for a while. And so this is how the book ends. You want me to go ahead and read these couple of pages here?
That'd be great.
Yeah, cool. By the way, I've not yet made it through one of these readings without getting a little emotional, so we'll see. See how we do here. This is for you guys, Mosaic. When the world breaks and you find that you've been robbed in spirit, when you look to that place within where you would hope to find hope and joy and power and peace, and instead find a poverty, may you know that you are in the terrain of heaven, because the soul is not a closed system. We are conduits of God, and the open-heartedness that allowed you to be robbed as you suffered is the very disposition that will allow you to be filled with the divine. When the world breaks and you suffer great loss, whether it's the loss of hope, or the loss of a dream, or the loss of a beautiful arrangement, or the actual loss of someone you loved, may you mourn bravely, and in naming the void where the gift once stood, may you discover the eyes of your soul dilated, your inner being flooded with light. For nothing good can ever be lost in God, and the glory we yearn for is still with us. When the world breaks and you find your strength bridled either by circumstance or systems, when you find yourself unable to take for yourself the things you need, may you trust that an open hand is all that's needed to receive. For you will inherit everything, as nothing real was ever the possession of those who have bridled you in the first place. When the world breaks and you find yourself aching for things to be made right, either within you or around you, whether the fractures have happened in your life or have come against your life, may you trust the sacred pangs of hunger. May you know how holy your parched palate is. And rather than allowing your thirst to be slaked by false promises and faux justice, may your ache become a compass that leads you to a feast of peace. If you've been wronged and are finally given the rightful power of the victim to exact revenge, may you remember that you were forged from the same moral fabric as the one who violated you. And without creating a false equivalence between victims and those who have perpetrated their suffering, may we remember our own need for mercy. If you find your heart darkened by cynicism, may you see past the illusion that corruption is the final word. May your own shadows be the proving ground for a more perceptive vision, and may the eyes of your heart be enlightened, giving you an uncommon capacity to see God, to see light, in even the darkest corners of our world. If you find yourself called out into the borderlands, into the no man's land beyond your own faction, forsaking group belonging, and if in those borderlands you find yourself desperately alone, feared by your enemies and called a traitor by your own, may you discover that you've become a child of God, claimed by the divine. May you discover a cosmic and irrevocable sense of belonging as you walk the lonely path of peace. If you find yourself persecuted, made a target by the powers of disorder that are breaking the world, may you know that you've become a threat to the disorder. You've become a conduit of the divine. You have become an agent of love. So when the world breaks and it tries to break us, may we trust that we too will be raised up. Peace to you, friends.
What a great way to end that. Beautiful. Jason, thanks for your time, man.
Yeah, my privilege, Blake. Big fan of yours, Mosaic. Really grateful to be with y'all. Thanks.
Yeah, cheers.